50 years, a lifetime, more than a lifetime for the boy I was when I last stood here. The bus dropped me off on the main road, and I walked the rest of the way, this old man with a map drawn from memory. I was afraid I wouldn't find it, that it would all be a shopping mall or a housing estate. But no, it's still a field. That was the first shock. It's just a field. A peaceful, rolling French field, green and gold in the afternoon sun, with a few lazy cows grazing where hell itself used to be. I stood at the edge of it, and my knees went a little weak. It was so quiet. That was the thing that hit me hardest, the quiet. No, not quiet, silence. A deep, thick silence that felt wrong. My ears, even after all these years, they were still braced for it, braced for the roar, the constant, world-ending roar of the artillery. The Donner und Blitzen, we called it, the thunder and lightning, but that sounds too poetic. It was just noise, a hammer hitting the inside of your skull, day and night, until you thought you'd go mad. And in between the shelling, the other sounds, the sounds you tried to block out but never could. The moaning of the wounded, a guy crying for his mother, the ragged, scared breathing of the man next to you. But now, nothing. Just the buzz of a bee and the wind rustling the grass. It was like trying to reconcile two different planets. The one I was standing on now, warm and alive, and the one that existed in my head, a blasted, cratered moonscape of mud and death. I closed my eyes, and I could still see it, the way it was in 44. The trees were just splintered toothpicks sticking out of the churned-up earth. There was no color, just shades of gray and brown and a sickening, oily black. The mud, my God, the mud. It was a living thing. It sucked at your boots, clung to your uniform. It got in your food, your mouth, your soul. You'd try to sleep, and you'd just be lying in a cold, wet grave. And the smell, that's something they never tell you about in the history books. The smell of cordite and burnt powder, of damp wool and sweat, but underneath it all, the sweet, rotten smell of death. It got into your clothes, your hair, you could taste it. And here I was, 50 years later, smelling wildflowers and fresh-cut hay. My heart was pounding in my chest, a frantic drumbeat that belonged to that other time, a ghost rhythm in this peaceful place. I had to force my feet to move, one in front of the other, into the field. The map in my head was fuzzy, distorted by time and terror. I walked slowly, my eyes scanning the ground, looking for, I don't know what, a sign, a scar. It all looked so smooth, so gentle. But then I saw it. Just a shallow depression in the earth, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, half hidden by long grass and a stubborn, thorny bush. My breath caught in my throat. It was still here, my foxhole, our foxhole. I knelt down, my old bones creaking in a way that hands never got the chance to. The earth was cool and damp. I reached out a trembling hand and touched the soil, and it was like touching a live wire. The memories didn't just come back. They flooded me. They swallowed me whole. I was no longer an old man in a quiet field. I was a boy, a terrified boy, shivering in a hole in the ground. The one thing that was exactly the same, the one sense that hadn't changed a bit, was the smell of the damp earth. As soon as my fingers dug into the soil, that cool, dark, mineral smell rose up, and I was right back there. It was raining, a cold, relentless drizzle that had been falling for days. We were soaked to the bone, our fingers numb and clumsy. Me and Hans, we were sharing this hole. It was too small for two, really, so we had to sit pressed up against each other, back to back, for warmth and for the simple, stupid comfort of feeling another human being. Hans Muller. He had a laugh that could cut through the gloom, a real booming laugh. He was from Hamburg, and he was always talking about the fish market there, about the boats coming in at dawn, the gulls screaming, the smell of the sea. He said when this was all over, he was going to buy a little boat. Not a fishing boat, he was sick of fish, he'd say, but a little sailboat. He'd sail it down the Elbe and out into the North Sea, and he'd just keep going. Somewhere they've never heard of Hitler or Stalin, he'd whisper in the dark. Somewhere quiet. We all had those dreams. They were the only currency we had left. We'd trade them like cigarettes. I was going to go back to my father's carpentry shop. I was going to work with honest wood, to smell sawdust and varnish instead of cordite and death. I was going to marry Elsa, the girl from my village, and we were going to have a house with a red roof. Such simple, stupid dreams. They were all that kept you sane. That last night, the shelling was heavier than usual. The Americans had us zeroed in. They'd been probing our line for a week. The air was thick with the whistle and scream of incoming rounds, the ground shaking with each impact. You'd curl into a ball, press your face into the muddy wall of the hole and pray. You weren't praying to God, not really. You were just praying to the next second, to the chance to take one more breath. The noise was so loud it wasn't even noise anymore. It was a physical pressure, like being deep underwater. Hans and I didn't speak. We just sat there, shoulders touching, our helmets knocking together with every close blast. I remember the exact sound of his breathing, fast and shallow, and I remember the smell of his fear, sharp and sour, mixing with the smell of the wet earth and the wool of his greatcoat. Then came the sound that was different, not the whistle of a shell falling, but a sudden, sharp crack right on top of us, a direct hit on the lip of the Foxhole. The world exploded into white light and a deafening roar. Dirt and rock and shrapnel rained down on us. I was thrown against the side of the hole, my head ringing, my ears screaming with a high-pitched whine. For a few seconds there was a strange, echoing silence. The shelling had stopped, and then I heard it, a gurgling, wet sound next to me. I turned. Hans was slumped over. A piece of shrapnel, hot and twisted, had taken off half his shoulder. His eyes were wide open, looking at me, but they weren't seeing me. They were already looking at something else. He tried to say something, but it was just a bubble of blood on his lips. And then he was gone, just like that. The boy who dreamed of a sailboat was gone, in a hole full of mud in a field in France. I remember screaming, but I couldn't hear my own voice. I remember holding him, the warmth leaving his body, the front of my tunic turning dark and sticky with his blood. I sat with him like that until the medics found us at first light. They had to pry my fingers from his jacket. Kneeling there 50 years later, I could feel the ghost of that warmth on my hands. I could see his face, not as the broken body, but as it was an hour before, when he'd shared a piece of hardtack with me, making a joke about it being harder than the sergeant's head. I started talking to him then, just whispering into the air. "Hans," I said, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I couldn't do anything." But I wasn't just talking to him. I was talking to the boy I had been. That skinny, scared kid who cried for his mother in the dark, who jumped at every shadow, who learned to piss in a tin because you didn't dare stick your head above the parapet. I wanted to tell him it would be okay, that he would live to be an old man, that he would marry Elsa, he would have children and grandchildren, he would work with wood and have a house with a red roof. But he wouldn't have believed me. All he knew was the cold, the fear, and the unspoken pact we all made. That was the only thing that mattered out here. The grand strategy, the fatherland, the Führer, it was all nonsense, propaganda for people far from the mud. What was real was the man next to you, your buddy. You looked after him, and he looked after you. That was the only country we had left. And when you broke that pact, when you survived and he didn't, a piece of you died with him. The guilt is a heavy stone you carry in your gut for the rest of your life. You learn to live with the weight, but you never get to put it down. This patch of ground, this shallow dent in the earth that means nothing to the farmer who owns it, nothing to the cows that graze on it, this is the place where my life split in two. The before and the after. The boy I was died here with Hans. The man who crawled out of this hole was someone else, someone older, someone who had seen the absolute worst of what men can do to each other. I reached into my pocket then. My fingers closed around it, smooth and cool. A small, grey stone I'd picked up from a creek bed near my home in Bavaria. I held it in my palm for a moment, feeling its weight. It wasn't much, but it was something solid, something from the home we all fought for but never got to see. I leaned forward and pressed it down into the soft soil at the bottom of the depression, right where we'd sat. It was a silly gesture, I suppose. A memorial for no one but me, a marker for a ghost. But it felt important. It felt like I was burying something, finally. Not Hans, he's long gone, but maybe I was burying some of the guilt. Maybe I was leaving a piece of that heavy stone here in the earth where it belonged. People think a war ends on a certain date. They have parades, they give speeches. May 8th, 1945. The end of the war in Europe. A neat line in a history book. But for the soldiers, for the men who were there, the war never really ends. It just goes quiet. It follows you home. It's in the way you jump at a car backfiring, the way you can't stand crowded rooms, the way you wake up in a cold sweat, your heart pounding because you were back in the mud, hearing the shells come in. It's a ghost that lives in your head. But standing up, brushing the dirt from my knees, I felt something I hadn't felt in 50 years. A small, fragile sense of peace. It wasn't a miracle. The memories were still there, sharp as ever. The ghost of Hans was still there. But I had finally come back. I had looked my younger self in the eye, and I had survived it. I had confronted the place of my worst nightmare and found that it was just a field. I turned my back on the foxhole and started walking toward the road. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I was carrying it with me, but somehow it felt a little lighter now. The war was still a part of me, but for the first time I felt like maybe I was finally leaving a little piece of it behind. You don't learn this in any manual. They can teach you to march, to shoot, to salute, but they can't teach you how to live inside the war, how to make a life in the middle of all that death. That knowledge, it gets into your bones like the damp. It becomes a part of you. And 50 years later, sitting in my warm house, I can still feel it, that cold, gritty truth of survival. Your world shrinks, see? It's not about grand strategies or flags on a map. Your world becomes the few feet of dirt you're standing in, the man to your left, the man to your right, and the simple, desperate rules for seeing the next sunrise. Your foxhole, that's your castle. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? A hole in the ground, maybe 6 feet long, 4 feet deep, filled with cold mud and the smell of damp earth and your own fear. But it's all you have. It's the only thing between you and the shrapnel. So you personalize it. You have to. It's a human thing. I had a little photo of my mother, tucked into a crack in the dirt wall, next to a small wooden cross my younger sister had carved for me. The paper got soft from the moisture, her face started to blur, but just knowing it was there mattered. Another guy in my squad, Mikey, he'd liberated a red-checkered tablecloth from some shattered farmhouse, and he'd lined the bottom of his hole with it, like he was having a picnic in hell. It was the craziest, most beautiful thing. You learned real quick where everything was, especially your entrenching tool. That little folding shovel was more important than your rifle sometimes. If a shell lands close and you're caught in the open, that tool is your ticket underground. You develop a sense for it, like you know where your own hands are. You'd wake up from a 10-minute doze, and your fingers would just brush the wooden handle, just to be sure. And the rain, God, the rain, it would turn your hole into a cold bath. You'd sit there in the dark, water seeping through your clothes, and you'd bail with your helmet, just a steady, miserable rhythm. Scoop, toss, scoop, toss. The sound of water splashing back into the mud was the soundtrack to so many nights. You give anything for a few minutes of dryness, for the feeling of not being soaked to the bone. That's what defined life at the front, this weird, gritty economy. What did we value? Not money. Money was useless paper. A pair of dry socks. That was a king's ransom. I'm not joking. Finding a clean, dry pair of wool socks in your pack could change your whole outlook. It was a small piece of comfort, a tiny defense against the trench foot that could rot your feet right off. A warm meal, a real one, not the cold Cretan tins, but something hot from the field kitchen that actually made it up to the line before it froze. That was a religious experience. You'd savor every bite, hold the warmth in your mouth, and sleep. Uninterrupted sleep was a myth, a fantasy we talk about like it was some far-off paradise. Just one night, boys, just one night where nobody shoots at us. We had our own currency, and it was cigarettes. Luckies, Camels, Chesterfields. They were gold. You could trade a couple of cigarettes for a cup of real coffee, not that chicory rubbish. A whole pack might get you a can of beef stew, or if you were really lucky, a bar of chocolate from a care package. I saw a guy trade his watch for a half-pint of whiskey once. Didn't even blink. You learned to scavenge, but not for treasure. You'd come across an abandoned pack, maybe from some poor soul who didn't make it, and you'd rifle through it with a grim practicality. You weren't looking for a medal. You were looking for a clean bandage, a full canteen, a dry pair of gloves. It was a desperate kind of shopping, and it felt awful, but it was necessary. You did what you had to do to keep going. And that's where the real science came in, the science of staying alive. This wasn't something they taught you in basic training. This was knowledge written in blood and learned by ear. You learned the music of death, the different whistles of the shells. Incoming has a different sound than outgoing. It's hard to describe, but you learn it. An outgoing shell sort of fades away, a sigh moving off into the distance. But an incoming, it's a rising scream, a tearing of the sky that gets louder and louder until it fills the whole world. Your body knows the difference before your brain does. Your stomach clenches, your ears prick up, and you're diving for that hole before you even consciously think to. You learn the art of stillness. A sniper could be watching, his crosshairs scanning the line for any movement. So you become part of the mud. You learn to breathe shallow, to not even blink too much. You'd lie there for hours, frozen, watching a fly crawl across your rifle stock, feeling every single pebble digging into your hip. And you develop a sixth sense. The officers in the rear, with their maps and their telephones, they thought they knew when an attack was coming. But we knew. There was a feeling in the air, a tension. The other side would get quiet, too quiet. The sporadic machine gun fire would stop. The air would feel heavy, charged. You'd look at the guy next to you, and he'd give you a slight nod. He felt it too. It's coming, you'd think. Strap in. It's coming. That feeling in the pit of your stomach was more reliable than any intelligence report. But the most important rules, the ones that really kept you human, were the unwritten ones, the code of conduct. There was an understanding sometimes with the poor bastards on the other side of the line. Not always, but during quiet periods, you knew they were just like you. Scared kids, cold, hungry, wanting to go home. I remember one night, during a lull in the shelling, we could hear them singing. A Christmas carol, I think it was. Still Nacht, Silent Night. It drifted across Narmansland, clear and sad. And for a few minutes nobody fired a shot. There was just this shared moment of misery and beauty, a mutual desire to just survive another day. You learned to be quiet, to be invisible. You never, ever shone a light at night. A match to light a cigarette could be your last. You learned to cup your hands around it, to hide the glow. You didn't make unnecessary noise, not for your sake, but for the man in the next hole. Your noise could get him killed. His noise could get you killed. We were all in it together. And that's the biggest rule of all, the one that trumped everything else. You didn't fight for the flag, not really, not in the moment. You didn't fight for some general or some politician 1,000 miles away. You fought for the man to your left and the man to your right. You fought for Mikey, who missed his girl back in Ohio, and for Jenkins, who was always humming some tune under his breath. They were your family. Their survival was your survival. Their fear was your fear. You'd share your last cigarette, your last bit of water. You'd risk your life to drag a wounded buddy back to safety, because the thought of leaving him out there was worse than the thought of dying yourself. That bond, it's something you can't explain to anyone who wasn't there. It's deeper than blood. I remember one time, we'd been holding a section of line for what felt like weeks. The mud was so deep it could suck the boots right off your feet. We were exhausted, filthy, our nerves stretched so thin you could hear them hum. We got a rare hot meal delivered, a stew of some kind. I was so hungry I could have eaten the can. I was just about to take my first bite when a shell landed maybe 50 yards away. Dirt and debris rained down on us. I didn't even think. I threw myself over my mess tin, shielding that pathetic bit of stew with my body. When the dust settled, I sat up, covered in muck, and looked at my tin. It was safe, just a little grit in it. I remember feeling a surge of triumph like I'd won a small battle. That's how low the bar was. That stew was everything in that moment. Later that night, on watch, I could hear Jenkins whispering next to me. "You okay, Carl?" he asked. I just grunted. "That was a close one," he said. And then in the dark, I heard the faint sound of him unwrapping something. "Here," he said, and his hand found my shoulder, pressing a small, hard object into my palm. It was a piece of hard candy, the kind your grandmother might have. "My mom sent it," he whispered. "Don't let the others see." I put that candy in my mouth and let it dissolve slowly. The sweetness was almost painful, it was so good. It tasted like home, like a world that wasn't made of mud and fear. That small act of kindness in the middle of all that was a lifeline. It was a reminder that we were still men, not just animals trying to survive. The fear was a constant companion, a cold stone in your gut. It was there when you woke up. It was there when you tried to sleep. It had a smell, too, a mix of cordite, damp wool, and cold sweat. But you learned to live with it. You joked about it. That's another thing they don't tell you, the dark gallows humor. We'd make bets on which shell would land closest. We'd give names to the big guns that shelled us regularly. There was one we called Big Bertha's ugly sister. It sounds crazy, but laughing in the face of it was the only way to stop from screaming. You'd get so homesick it was a physical ache. You'd lie there and think about your mother's cooking, the smell of fresh bread, the feel of clean sheets on a soft bed. You'd remember a girl you danced with, the feel of her hand in yours, and it would feel like a dream from another life. Those memories were both a comfort and a torture. They were what you were fighting for, the reason you had to survive, but thinking about them too much could make the present moment unbearable. So you learned to lock those thoughts away in a small box in your mind, to be opened only in the quietest, safest moments. And through it all, there was the waiting. War is mostly waiting. waiting for the attack, waiting for relief, waiting for food, waiting for the shelling to stop. Your mind plays tricks on you during the waiting. Every shadow looks like an enemy soldier. Every crack of a branch sounds like a rifle shot. You hear things that aren't there. Your imagination becomes your worst enemy. But you also talk. You talk about everything and nothing. You talk about the cars you're going to buy after the war, the farms you're going to start, the girls you're going to marry. You build this future, this beautiful, peaceful future, plank by plank in your conversations. It's what keeps you going, that shared dream. And you learn to read each other's faces, each other's silences. You know when a buddy is about to break, and you know what to say or what not to say to pull him back. A shared look, a nod, a nudge with your elbow, that was all the communication you needed. That was the unwritten code, the grammar of survival. It was a brutal, simple education. They taught us how to be soldiers, but the Foxhole taught us how to be men, how to find a shred of humanity in the most inhuman place on earth. And you never, ever forget those lessons. They're etched into you, deeper than any scar. You never really think about mail, about a simple letter, until you're cut off from everything you've ever known. Over here, in the mud and the cold of France, a letter wasn't just paper and ink. It was a lifeline. It was a 10-minute vacation from the war, a whisper from a world that was starting to feel like a dream you had once, a long time ago. And the waiting for it, that was its own special kind of torture. Every afternoon, if the shelling wasn't too bad, we'd see the mail runner coming down the line, a young kid with a satchel that held more hope than any general's orders ever could. We'd all try to play it cool, leaning against the muddy wall of the trench or pretending to clean our rifles, but every one of us was watching him, our guts tied in a knot. You'd hear him call out names. Miller T., letter from Ohio. And Miller's face would just light up like it was Christmas morning. Rizzo, package from your ma. And Rizzo would whoop, and we'd all crowd around, hoping for a share of the cookies we knew were inside. But when he passed by your hole without so much as a glance, when that satchel was empty and he moved on to the next company, well, that feeling was a hollow ache right in the center of you. It was worse than fear in a way. Fear was sharp and sudden. This was a dull, constant emptiness. You try to hide the jealousy, you really would. You'd slap Miller on the back and say, "Good for you, pal." But inside, you were just a kid staring through a candy store window. We all got superstitious. I knew a guy from Kentucky who'd always put his left boot on first on mail day. Another fella had to smoke exactly half a cigarette before the runner showed up. Me. I'd always run my thumb over this little St. Christopher medal my girlfriend gave me. It was stupid. We all knew it was stupid. But in a place where luck was the only thing between you and a coffin, you clung to any ritual you thought might help. You deconvince yourself that maybe the mail was just delayed, that a ship was slow, that your folks were busy. But in the quiet moments the thought would creep in, maybe they've forgotten you. Maybe life back home just went on and you were already a ghost to them. Then the day would come. You'd hear your name, just your name, but it sounded sweeter than any music. Schmidt, letter for Schmidt. And your heart would just about leap out of your chest. You'd take that envelope, your hands shaking so bad you were afraid you'd de-tear it. It felt thin, so fragile in your dirty, calloused hands. You de-smell it first. Right there, standing in the muck, you'd hold it up to your nose. And sometimes, if you were lucky, there'd be a faint, faint trace of a perfume, or just the smell of the house, of clean linen and polish, a smell so alien and beautiful it could make your eyes water. You couldn't read it right then. No, sir. This was a ceremony. You had to find the right moment. You'd wait until you were back in your foxhole, maybe after dark, when things were quieter. You'd pull out your mess tin, try to wipe it clean with a rag, and use it as a little table. You get out your Zippo, not for a smoke, but for the light, cupping the flame against the damp air. And then you'd read, not fast. Oh no, you'd savor it like a starving man with a steak, every single word. You'd read a sentence, then stop and just think about it, picturing it all in your head. My Elsa, she'd write about the most ordinary things, and to me, they were more precious than diamonds. She'd write about how our dog, Kaiser, had gotten into the garden and dug up all her mother's carrots. She described the new dress she'd saved up for, a light blue color like the sky. She'd tell me about a silly argument her brother had with his boss at the bakery. And I'd be sitting there, in a hole filled with cold water, the smell of cordite and decay all around me, reading about carrots and bakery arguments, and I'd be weeping. Not loud, just quiet tears cutting paths through the grime on my cheeks. That single piece of paper was a shield. For those few minutes, the war disappeared. The thunder of the artillery was just a distant rumble. The moaning of the wounded was a dream. All that was real was her words, her world. I'd read that letter until I almost had it memorized. Then I'd fold it back up, careful not to crease it too much, and put it in the inside pocket of my jacket, right over my heart. That letter was my most important piece of gear. More important than my rifle, in a way. My rifle kept my body alive. That letter kept my soul from dying. But then came the hard part, writing back, sitting down with a pencil and a pad of V-mail paper, trying to find the words. What could you possibly say? How do you describe the indescribable? You couldn't tell them the truth. God, no. You couldn't write, "Dear Elsa, today my best friend Jimmy had his head blown off 3 feet from me, and I had to wipe his brains off my face with my sleeve." You couldn't say, "The smell here is awful. It's the smell of death, of latrines, and of men who haven't bathed in months." You couldn't tell them about the constant, gnawing fear that lived in your belly, or the sound a man makes when he's dying, a sound that's not human at all. So you lied. You built a beautiful, peaceful lie for them. You'd write about the beautiful French countryside, how green the fields were, without mentioning they were littered with shell craters and dead cows. You talk about the charming little villages, omitting the fact they were just piles of rubble. Say the food was adequate, when most days it was a cold, greasy can of stew or hardtack that could break a tooth. You became an author, creating a fiction of your life for the people you loved most. The hardest questions to answer were about the future. When do you think you'll be home? She'd ask. What should we do about the garden in the spring? And you're sitting there, writing by the light of a burning farmhouse, and you have no future. You don't believe you'll ever see another spring. Tomorrow is a fantasy. Next week is an eternity away, so you'd write something vague. The war can't last forever, sweetheart. We'll plant those roses together soon. You'd force yourself to sound hopeful, because they needed that hope, even if you had none left for yourself. It was a terrible weight, crafting those cheerful little lies, each one feeling like a betrayal of the truth you were living, but it was a burden we all carried willingly. It was our duty to protect them from the nightmare. Then there were the letters you never sent. Every one of us had them. You get a quiet moment, a rare pocket of time when the fear was just too much to hold inside, and you'd take out your pencil and just pour it all out onto the paper. The terror, the despair, the sheer, gut-wrenching homesickness. You'd write the letter you really wanted to send. My dearest Elsa, I am so scared. I don't think I'm going to make it. I saw things today that I will never be able to forget. I just want to come home. I just want to hold you again. You'd write until your hand cramped, until the tears blurred the ink. And then, when you were done, when you had purged that poison from your system, you'd read it over once, and then you'd light a match and burn it. You'd watch the edges curl and blacken, the words turning to ash. You couldn't send that. That would be a cruelty, but you had to write it. You had to give the fear a voice somewhere, even if no one would ever hear it. And of course, there was the other letter. The one we all wrote, but nobody talked about. The just-in-case letter. You'd write it after a particularly bad battle, or when you had a feeling in your bones that your number was up. You'd find a quiet corner and write your last words, telling her you loved her, telling your parents you were proud to be their son, trying to sum up your entire life in a few paragraphs. You'd de-seal it, write her name on the front, and put it in your pocket. That piece of paper felt heavier than all the ammunition you were carrying. It was a confession, a will, and a goodbye, all in one. And you pray to a God you weren't sure was listening that you'd never have to send it, that you'd be able to tear it up someday and laugh about how scared you were. But you kept it on you, because it was the only part of you that had a chance of going home if you didn't. That's the thing they don't tell you about war. It's not just the big battles, the charges and the medals. It's the small things. It's the weight of a single piece of paper in your pocket. It's the taste of a home-baked cookie that your buddy shares with you, a taste so sweet it hurts. It's the sound of a harmonica playing a sad song at dusk, and everyone getting quiet, thinking their own private thoughts. It's the feel of a dry pair of socks, a little piece of heaven. It's the dark jokes we tell to keep from screaming. It's the way you'd look at the man next to you in the Foxhole, a guy you wouldn't have given the time of day to back in Civvy Street, and you just knew, that you'd give your life for him without a second thought. That was the real war, the war inside us, the struggle to remember what it was like to be human, to be clean, to be safe. And that struggle was fought every day, with every letter we got and every letter we wrote. That worn, thin paper, smudged with dirt and maybe a drop of blood, was our flag. It was the standard we fought under, the reminder of what we were fighting for. Not for glory, not for politics, but for the right to go back to a world where a letter was just a letter and not the most important thing in your life. You never forget the sound. That's the Guard's honest truth. It wasn't like in the movies. It was a scream that tore right through all the other noised artillery, the machine guns, the god-awful crump of mortars landing. It was a high, desperate sound, a sound that stripped a man down to nothing but pure fear. Medic, oh God, medic. And when you heard it, your training took over. Every other fella in the outfit, they'd hit the dirt, burrow into whatever cover they could find. But my job was to get up, to run toward it. Your heart would be pounding in your ears, a drumbeat screaming at you to stay down, but your legs would just start moving. You weren't a hero. You were just a kid from Ohio who'd taken an oath, and somewhere out there, another kid was calling for you, believing you could fix what all that German steel had torn apart. Those first few moments of triage were the worst part of the whole damn war, bar none. It wasn't about medicine then, not really. It was about playing guard with a stopwatch. You drop down into a shell crater or a ditch, and there'd be 2, 3, sometimes 5 fellas all torn up. And you had to make a choice in a split second. You're looking at a man with his guts in his hands, his eyes wide with a kind of shocked confusion, and you just know, there's nothing you or anyone else can do. Then you look at the kid next to him. He's got a leg mostly gone, but the tourniquet you slapped on him earlier is holding. He's conscious. He's begging for his mother. And then there's the other one, unconscious, bleeding from a head wound, his breathing a wet, ragged sound. You had to choose. You had to look at that first fella, the one who was a goner, and you'd have to say, "I'll be back for you, pal," a lie that tasted like ash in your mouth, and you'd turn to the one with a chance. That's what they called it, the ones with a chance. The ones you could maybe get back to the aid station if you moved fast enough. I remember the feel of a plasma bottle, cold and smooth in my hand, even in the middle of all that heat and sweat. You'd fumble with the tubing, your fingers thick and clumsy, trying to find a vein in an arm that was already turning grey. You're shouting at him, "Stay with me, soldier. Look at me. What's your girl's name? Tell me about your girl." All the while you're praying, just a silent, desperate prayer, please. Please let this work. Please let this run in before he shuts his eyes for good. It was a race, a terrible, frantic race against a clock you couldn't see. My medical pouch was this beat-up canvas bag, and it felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. It was more than just bandages and sulfur powder, though God knows we used mountains of that white, chalky stuff, dumping it into wounds to fight off the infection. That pouch was hope. When a wounded man saw you slinging that bag off your shoulder, you could see a little bit of the terror leave his eyes. It meant someone was there. It meant he wasn't alone in the dirt. We didn't have time for fancy tools. The scissors they gave us were useless, too slow. I used my bayonet more for cutting away bloody, muddy uniforms than I ever did for fixing it to the end of my rifle. You just saw through the wool, the cold metal of the blade right next to hot skin, trying to find the source of the bleeding. And the morphine, the morphine was the worst kind of blessing. We had these little syrettes, like tiny metal tubes. You pinch off the seal, jab the needle in, and squeeze the morphine in. The relief on a man's face was instant, a wave of peace washing over the pain. But the fear of running out, that was a constant, grinding dread in the back of your mind. When the casualties were heavy, when you were going from one guy to the next, you'd feel your pouch getting lighter, and you'd start to ration it, giving half doses, knowing it wasn't enough, but needing to make it stretch for the next guy and the next. You'd look at a fella screaming in agony, and you'd have to make another impossible choice. War makes you do things you never thought you could. You find a dark kind of humor in it, just to stay sane. Me and the other medics, we'd joke about our office, which was whatever patch of mud was currently being used as an aid station. We'd call a bad wound a $1 million blow, because that's what the insurance payout was. It sounds cold, but you had to laugh, or you just sit down and start crying and never get up again. We were all just kids, 19, 20 years old. We missed home so bad it was a physical ache. We'd talk about our mom's apple pie, or the smell of fresh-cut grass, or the girl we'd left behind, holding on to her picture like a talisman. In quiet moments, you'd stare at that photograph until your eyes blurred, trying to remember what it felt like to be safe, to be clean, to not be afraid. Then a shell would land nearby, and the fantasy would vanish in a shower of dirt and reality. The faces. That's what I brought home with me. Not the medals, not the stories they tell in veterans' halls. The faces. There was this one kid, couldn't have been more than 18. Fresh-faced, still had a little baby fat on his cheeks. He took a piece of shrapnel in the chest. I got to him, and he looked up at me, his eyes clear and blue and so damn young. He said, "Doc, am I gonna be okay?" And I looked at the wound, and I knew he was. But I smiled, this big, fake smile that felt like it was cracking my face, and I said, "You bet you are, son. Just a scratch. You'll be sipping a beer in Paris by tomorrow." I started working on him, but it was useless. He kept his eyes locked on mine, and he believed me. He believed that lie right up until the moment the light went out of those blue eyes. I closed his eyelids with my thumb, and I've hated the sound of the word okay ever since. Then there were the ones where there was nothing left to do. No plasma, no morphine, no bandage big enough. The only tool you had left was your humanity. You de-cradle a man's head in your lap, the mud soaking through your pants, and you'd hold his hand. His grip would be so tight, like he was trying to hold onto this world by his fingernails. He'd be calling for someone Margaret or Mama. And you'd lean in close, the smell of blood and dirt filling your nose, and you'd whisper, "I'm here, Margaret. I'm right here. You're not alone." You'd say it over and over until his hand went slack. It was the last bit of comfort you could offer, a small lie to send a soul on its way. And then there was the other side of the coin. The surreal, monstrous other side. One moment you're a saver of lives, the next you're a taker. We were set up in a makeshift aid station in a bombed-out cellar. We had maybe a dozen wounded in there, lying on stretchers. The fighting was swirling all around, and suddenly 2 German soldiers burst in, their Schmeisers pointed at us. They were just kids, too, scared out of their minds. For a second, everything froze. I saw the look in their eyes, the panic. And I saw the look in the eyes of my patients, helpless on the ground. I wasn't a fighter, I was a medic. But in that instant, I was the only one standing with a weapon. My .45 felt heavy and alien in my hand. I didn't think. I just raised it and fired. The sound was deafening in that small space. One of them went down. The other one dropped his rifle and put his hands up, crying. I disarmed him, my hands shaking so bad I could barely function. I looked at the boy I'd shot. He was maybe 17. He was dying, and there was nothing I could do for him. I had just created another patient, another soul I couldn't save. I went from medic to executioner and back to medic in the span of 30 seconds. You don't ever forget that feeling. It hollows you out. Coming home was its own kind of strange battle. My hands were clean. I'd scrubbed them 1,000 times. But my soul felt stained, permanently dirty. People would slap me on the back, call me a hero. "You saved so many lives," they'd say. And I'd smile and nod, but all I could think about were the ones I didn't save. Every single one. Charlie, who bled out before I could find the artery. Jimmy, who died of infection 3 days after I'd patched him up. That young German boy in the cellar. Their faces were my real company, not the folks back home who couldn't possibly understand. The guilt was a constant companion, heavier than any pack I ever carried. That's why 50 years later I had to go back. It wasn't a vacation, it was a pilgrimage. I had to stand there on that quiet, peaceful hillside in France. The craters were softened by grass and wildflowers. The trees had grown back. There was no sound but the wind and birds singing. I found the place, or close to it, where my old foxhole had been. I knelt down in the dirt, and I let it all come back. The noise, the fear, the smell of cordite and damp earth. I could almost hear the whispers of my buddies, the ones who never left this place. I took out a small, worn list of names from my wallet, names I'd kept all these years. I read them aloud, my voice rough with emotion, telling each one that I remembered him, that I was sorry, that I hoped he was at peace. I needed them to know that they weren't forgotten statistics. They were boys I had smoked with, shared rations with, joked with. They were the ones who carried the real burden. I was just the guy who tried, and failed, to lighten it for some of them. I left a small, smooth stone from my garden back home on a tree stump, a little marker for no one but me in them. I finally said the goodbye I never got to say all those years ago. It didn't erase the memories, nothing ever could. But it quieted them, just a little. It let me finally lay a part of that burden down, right there in the French soil, next to the boys who had to stay behind. You never forget the sound. That's the guard's honest truth. People talk about the big things, the battles, the names on a map, but for us, it was the noise that defined it. It was this constant, roaring pressure in your ears, a symphony of destruction that went on for so long you forgot what silence even was. And then, just like that, it stopped. It was in the spring of 45, somewhere in a patch of woods in Germany that didn't have a name we knew, just a grid reference on a tired map. We'd been pushing, see, for days on end, living on nerves and cigarettes, and that cold fear that sits in your gut like a stone. The air was thick with the smell of it all, cordite and damp earth and something else, something sweet and awful that you didn't want to think about. My hands were raw from the cold, and the grip on my M1, the wood stock feeling like it was part of my own bones. We were laying down fire, a frantic, desperate kind of covering fire, tracers cutting red lines through the misty dawn, and the Krauts were giving it back just as hard. It was all noise and movement, a blur of green and grey and flashes of orange. And then there was a lull, just for a second. And in that second you realized the return fire had stopped. Not slowed down, but stopped dead. We kept shooting for a few more seconds out of pure habit, muscle memory, and then an order was barked, a hoarse shout that got lost in the sudden quiet. And that's when it hit you. The silence. It was the loudest, most unnerving sound I'd ever heard. It was a physical weight, this silence, pressing down on your ears that were so used to being battered. You could hear your own heart hammering in your chest, the ragged breath catching in your throat. You looked at the guy next to you, old Smitty from Chicago, his face smeared with dirt and exhaustion, and you saw the same disbelief in his eyes. We didn't trust it. Silence like that, it usually meant an ambush was coming, or a mortar barrage was about to rain down. We stayed low in our foxholes, rifles still pointed, fingers tense on the triggers, waiting for the other shoe to drop. But it didn't. Minutes stretched out, and all you could hear was the wind rustling the leaves of a shattered tree, the drip of water somewhere. It was a sound we hadn't heard in years, a sound that felt more foreign and dangerous than any gunfire. That was the end, though we didn't know it yet. Not really. The war just ran out of noise. The first day of peace, I woke up, and for the first time in I can't tell you how long, that immediate knot of fear wasn't in my stomach. And you know what? It felt wrong. It was unsettling, like missing a step on a staircase. Your body was so used to jolting awake, already braced for the day's horrors, that waking up to just quiet was a kind of shock. The sun was actually shining, a weak, pale sun, but it was light without the smoke haze. We stumbled out of our holes, stretching aching muscles, and that's when we saw them. The enemy. They were coming out of their positions too, across the field, looking just as ragged and worn out as we were. Just boys. Scared, tired boys in Felgrau uniforms. They held their hands up empty, their faces a mask of the same relief and numbness we felt. There was no hatred in that moment, not really. Just this profound, overwhelming exhaustion that went right down to your soul. One of them, he couldn't have been more than 18, had a dirty bandage around his head, and he just looked at me, and I looked at him, and we both gave this little nod. Nothing needed to be said. We'd all been in the same nightmare. Some of the guys lit cigarettes and offered them around, a shared silence that was louder than any words. I tried to feel joy, I really did. I thought about home, about my mom's cooking, about my girl, Betty, waiting for me. But there was nothing there, just a hollowed-out feeling, a numbness. It was like all the feeling had been burned out of me, used up in those last months of pushing across France and into Germany. The relief everyone expected us to feel, it just wasn't there. It was too big, too heavy. It was a void. In the days that followed, that's when the real strangeness began. They took our rifles, for one thing. They just collected them. And my hands felt so damn empty. That M1 had been an extension of my arm for so long, the weight of it was a comfort, a certainty. Without it, I felt naked, vulnerable. My fingers would twitch, looking for the familiar curve of the stock. We were given other jobs, clean-up details, but it all felt like makework. Pointless. The adrenaline that had been keeping us going for years had just evaporated, and what was left was this bone-deep weariness that sleep couldn't fix. We'd sit around, me and the boys, and we'd try to talk about what we were gonna do when we got home. But it was hard. It was like trying to remember a dream from a long time ago. Who was I before all this? Before the mud and the blood and the constant, grinding fear? I used to like working on cars with my dad. I dreamed of being a mechanic, having my own little garage. But that felt like someone else's life, a story I'd been told about a different boy. That boy was gone. He got left behind in a foxhole in Normandy, on a road in Belgium, in the snow of the Ardennes. Talking to people from back home, even in letters, was difficult. They'd write about the price of butter or who was dating who, and you'd read it and just feel this vast, unbridgeable gap. How could you ever explain what it was like? The smell of a burning tank, the sound a man makes when he's hit, the way the cold seeps into you until you think you'll never be warm again. They meant well, but they'd never understand. So you stopped trying. You just joked about it with the other guys, the only ones who spoke your language. We had a dark humor, a survival humor. Like the time Jenkins got his helmet shot right off his head and all he could say was, "Well, I guess I don't have to worry about a haircut this week." You laughed because if you didn't laugh, you'd cry, and if you started crying, you were afraid you might never stop. Saying goodbye to the men was the hardest part, harder even than some of the fighting. These guys, they were more than friends, they were my brothers. We'd seen each other at our absolute worst, scared out of our minds, covered in filth, crying like babies. We'd shared our last cigarette, our last bit of chocolate, our last dry pair of socks. We knew each other's fears, and we knew we could count on each other absolutely to the end. Smitty, who could fix anything with a piece of wire and a curse word. O'Malley, who sang dirty Irish songs to keep our spirits up. Young Peterson, who was just a kid but had the heart of a lion. We made promises, you know how you do. We'll get together next year. I'll come visit you in Texas. You're gonna meet my sister. But we all knew, deep down, that it was the end of something. We were saying goodbye to the men we were in that war. Back in the world, we'd be different people. Civilians, strangers with a shared secret. The hugs were tight, the handshakes firm, and then you turned and walked away, and you didn't look back because it hurt too much. The journey home was long, on a crowded ship this time, no fear of U-boats, but the war came home with me. It was packed in my duffel bag, right alongside my dog tags. I'd flinch at the backfire of a car, my heart leaping into my throat. I'd catch myself scanning rooftops, looking for snipers in my own hometown. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sheets tangled, my ears ringing with the ghost of artillery fire. People would welcome me back, slap me on the back, call me a hero. But I didn't feel like a hero. I just felt tired and guilty. Guilty for making it back when so many better men didn't. My mom would make my favorite meal, part roast with potatoes, and it would taste like ash in my mouth. I'd sit on the porch with my dad, and he'd want to hear stories, but I couldn't give him the real ones. I'd give him the cleaned-up versions, the funny anecdotes, not the ones that haunted my dreams. Betty was wonderful, patient, but she wanted to hold my hand, and I'd jump if she moved too fast. She wanted the boy who went away, but that boy was gone. I was a man now, with a man's scars, and most of them were where you couldn't see them. It took a long, long time to even start to feel normal again. You learn to live with it, you build a life, you have kids of your own, but the war is always there, a part of you, like a shadow you can't shake. You finally understand, years later, that the real battle wasn't the one for some hill or town. That ended. The real battle was the one you fought every day after, for a peace of mind that you knew, in your heart, you were never going to fully get back. The guns fell silent in the spring of '45, but the war inside me, that's a sound that never really goes away.